The brick hit me before I even saw it coming. 1 second I was standing in my parents' living room, my fingers laced through Daniel's, admiring the way the lamplight caught the gold in his eyes as he laughed at something my father had said. The next second my vision went white, my ears filled with a high, thin ringing, and I was on the floor tasting copper and carpet fiber, my cheek pressed against the same rug I'd played on as a child. "You ungrateful little bitch," my father was screaming, but I couldn't focus on the words. They arrived distorted, underwater, competing with the pulse pounding behind my eyes. My hand went to my face on instinct and came away red. I remember staring at my own fingers like they belonged to someone else, like the blood was a color I'd never seen before. Then I heard my mother laugh. Not a gasp, not a scream. A laugh, short, sharp, almost delighted, the exact sound she made when I was 12 and tripped over the garden hose in front of the neighbors. I looked up at her through the blur, and she was standing by the china cabinet with her arms crossed, an expression on her face like she was watching a sitcom she'd already seen the ending of. "Get up," my sister said. She didn't kneel. She didn't reach for a napkin or a towel or anything to press against the gash opening along my cheekbone. She stood over me with her arms folded, mirroring our mother, and there was no pity in her voice, only impatience, like I was an inconvenience delaying something she'd been waiting for. Maybe now he'll see what he's giving up. That sentence took a moment to land, the way certain injuries do, the pain arriving late, once the shock clears enough to let it in. And when it did land, I understood something all at once, in the space of a single breath. This wasn't an accident of rage. My father hadn't lost control. This had been decided before I ever walked through that door, decided over some conversation I hadn't been part of, some agreement made in the kitchen or the car, or wherever families go to plan the unforgivable. It started 3 weeks earlier, when I brought Daniel home to meet my family for the first time. I remember being nervous in the ordinary way, wanting my father to approve of his handshake, wanting my mother to like the wine he'd picked out, wanting the evening to go smoothly the way you want any first meeting to go smoothly. I hadn't accounted for Run. She'd looked at him the way she looked at everything she wanted, which is to say like it already belonged to her, and the rest of us were simply standing in the way of the paperwork. I caught her doing it twice that first dinner, a long, assessing look up and down, the kind you give a dress in a shop window, not a person attached to your sister. I told myself I was imagining it. I told myself that a lot that year. It was easier than the alternative. By the second week, she was texting him. Small things at first, she told me later, as though smallness excused it, a meme, a "loved meeting you," a question about a restaurant he'd mentioned. By the third week she was showing up at his office, ostensibly to drop off a birthday gift for a mutual friend who worked in the same building, lingering by his desk in a way his coworkers apparently found strange enough to mention to him afterward. When he told her, gently but firmly, in the calm and unhurried voice I would come to know so well, that he loved me and wasn't interested in anything else, she didn't cry. She didn't apologize. She went straight to our parents and told them a version of events in which she was the victim, a woman scorned by circumstance, in love with a man who'd led her on before, choosing her sister out of some petty, arbitrary loyalty, and I was cast as the obstacle standing between her and a happiness she felt she deserved. I hadn't known any of this. Not one word of it. I only knew that my father had called the week before and asked us to come for dinner, his voice warm in the particular way that used to make me feel like the luckiest daughter in the world. I only knew that when we arrived, my mother had seemed strange, quieter than usual, refilling water glasses that didn't need refilling, avoiding my eyes over the roast chicken. I thought she was tired. I thought, at worst, that she and my father had argued about something unrelated to us, some old marital static I wasn't meant to notice. Ren wasn't at dinner. That should have told me something. She was always at family dinners, always the first to arrive and the last to leave, orbiting our parents the way she always had, hungry for a kind of attention I'd stopped competing for years ago. Her absence sat at the table like an empty chair nobody mentioned. Halfway through dessert, my mother's lemon cake, the one she only made for birthdays and Christmas, which in hindsight should have been its own kind of warning, my father stood up. I remember thinking, in the half-second before everything changed, that he was going to make a toast. He had that look, the little performative straightening of his shoulders he did before speeches. Daniel had just said something that made my father laugh, for real laugh, the kind that crinkled the corners of his eyes, and I was smiling too, still holding Daniel's hand under the table, thinking that this ease, this warmth, was exactly what I'd hoped for. Instead, my father reached past the centerpiece and picked up the decorative brick that had sat on the mantel behind him for as long as I could remember. It wasn't ornamental in any obvious way, just a plain red brick with a small brass plaque commemorating the year they'd bought the house, the kind of sentimental object every family has and stops truly seeing after enough years pass. I had walked past that brick 1,000 times without a single thought. I never imagined it as a weapon. I don't think anyone does, until the moment it becomes one. He swung it into my face while I was still smiling. There was no warning in his expression, no visible buildup of rage, nothing I could point to afterward and say I should have seen it coming. One moment, he was a father laughing at his daughter's fiancé's joke. The next, he was a stranger with my blood on his hand, breathing hard, staring down at me on the floor like I was something he needed to put down. Daniel didn't hesitate. He was already moving before I'd fully registered that I was falling, already sliding out of his chair and onto the floor beside me, already positioning his body between me and my father in a way that felt instinctive rather than decided. I remember the sound of his voice, steady, low, terrifyingly calm, as he pulled his phone from his pocket and started dialing, even as my father shouted at him to get out of his house, even as my mother's laughter rang out again behind him like some grotesque punctuation mark. "Sir, I need police and an ambulance," Daniel said, and his voice didn't shake at all, though his hands did, pressing his balled-up dinner jacket hard against the split skin of my cheek. I could feel the tremor in his fingers even through the pain, could feel how much effort it was costing him to sound calm. My mother stopped laughing somewhere in the middle of that call. I think it was the stillness of him that did it. The fact that he wasn't running, wasn't grabbing his coat and bolting for the door the way she must have assumed any outsider would when confronted with the true, ugly shape of our family. I think she'd expected exactly that. I think that had been part of the plan too, in whatever unspoken way plans like that get made, that Daniel would see us for what we were and flee, and Ren's path would clear itself without anyone having to say so aloud. He didn't flee. He knelt on that carpet in his good shirt, now ruined, blood soaking into the white cotton at his cuffs, and he looked up at my parents with an expression I had never once seen on his face in the 2 years I'd known him, something cold, unblinking, and absolutely, permanently certain. "You're done," he said. "All of you." And even through the pain, even through the ringing in my ears and the taste of copper and the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in the wound on my cheek, I understood that he meant it as a promise, not a threat, a promise to me, that whatever my family had tried to break in that room, it hadn't worked. 6 months later, I have a thin white scar along my cheekbone that the surgeon says will fade, but never fully disappear. In the beginning, that felt like a cruelty stacked on top of a cruelty, as though the universe hadn't been satisfied with the violence itself and needed to leave behind a permanent signature of it, something I would carry into every mirror for the rest of my life. But somewhere around the 4th month, lying awake at 2 a.m. with Daniel's arm heavy and warm across my waist, I stopped trying to make it disappear in my mind, either. Some things are meant to be visible, I think, proof that happened, so I never let myself wonder later if I imagined it, if I exaggerated it, if I was somehow the unreasonable one for walking away. The hospital that night is still fragmented in my memory, arriving in pieces rather than a single continuous scene. I remember the fluorescent lights of the emergency room, too bright, turning everyone's skin the color of paper. I remember a nurse asking me, gently, whether I felt safe going home, and the strange vertigo of realizing I didn't have a home to go back to anymore, not one that made sense. I remembered Daniel never leaving my side, not for the x-rays, not for the 17 stitches, not for the hours of paperwork and photographs a patient female officer took of my face at intervals, documenting the swelling as it changed shape overnight. I remember him answering questions for me when my voice gave out, and I remember, more than anything, the particular quality of his hand wrapped around mine, not tentative, not comforting in the soft, apologetic way people offer comfort to something fragile, but firm, anchoring, like he had decided somewhere in that emergency room that letting go of me was no longer a possibility his body would allow. My father was arrested 3 days later, once the police report and the officer's photographs and Daniel's statement had been compiled into something a prosecutor could use. I wasn't in the room when it happened. I was still at Daniel's apartment, propped up on pillows, unable to lie flat because of the swelling, but I heard about it from a family friend who happened to live 2 houses down and watched it unfold from her porch like the rest of the neighborhood did, curtains twitching, phones held low, and filming. My father was charged with aggravated assault, a felony, and though he ultimately took a plea deal that kept him out of a prison cell, it didn't keep him out of a courtroom, didn't keep his name and photograph out of the local paper, didn't keep the story from spreading through his old golf league and his church congregation and the hardware store where he'd been a regular for 20 years. I heard secondhand that people stopped calling, that the golf league quietly uninvited him from the Thursday tea times, that my parents' pastor made a pointed sermon about the sanctity of family that everyone in the congregation understood to be about them without his ever saying their names. There was a small, ugly satisfaction in hearing all of that, and I let myself feel it without apology because for years I had been taught that anger was unbecoming in a daughter, and I was done performing becomingness for people who had shown me exactly what they thought I was worth. My mother, technically, committed no crime by laughing. There's no statute for that. No line in a legal code that accounts for the specific violence of a mother who watches her husband open her daughter's face and responds with delight instead of horror. The police asked her questions, of course, took her statement along with everyone else's, but nothing came of it beyond a note in a file somewhere. I used to lie awake trying to understand what could possibly have been happening in her mind in that moment, whether it was cruelty, or some kind of psychological break, or a lifetime of favoring and finally curdling into something monstrous and involuntary. I don't know that I'll ever have a satisfying answer. Some questions don't resolve. They just eventually stop being the first thing you think about when you wake up. I filed her away all the same, in the part of my heart reserved for people I used to trust, not deleted, exactly, because you can't delete 26 years of birthdays and bedtime stories and the smell of her kitchen on Sunday mornings, but archived, sealed, no longer given access to the parts of me that are still tender. Rin sent one email, 3 weeks after the hospital. I remember opening it with a strange, detached curiosity, as though I were reading something addressed to a different version of myself. She wrote that she never meant for it to go that far, that she'd only wanted our parents to talk to me, to make me see reason, that she hadn't known what our father was capable of, as though a brick swung into her sister's face were an act of God rather than the direct, predictable culmination of a story she herself had authored and handed to our parents like a script. As though there were an acceptable distance for a father to carry a brick toward his daughter's face, some socially permissible radius within which violence became merely regrettable instead of unforgivable. I read the email twice, looking for something, an actual apology, an acknowledgement of what she'd set in motion, anything that suggested she understood the difference between what happened and what she'd wanted to happen. It wasn't there. I didn't respond. I have not responded since. And every few months another email arrives, shorter each time, the apologies growing thinner and the self-pity growing louder, and I let them collect unread in a folder I don't open. Daniel and I got married in April, 8 months after that dinner, in a small garden behind his aunt's house in the countryside. String lights threaded through the branches of 2 old oak trees and folding chairs arranged in uneven rows because his cousin had insisted on setting them up herself and refused all help. It was nothing like the wedding I'd once imagined as a girl. No grand hall, no towering cake, none of my own family in the front row dabbing at their eyes with monogrammed handkerchiefs. It was small and slightly imperfect and made entirely of people who had chosen to be there rather than people obligated by blood to show up. Daniel's mother cried through the whole ceremony, openly and without embarrassment, and afterward told me, holding both my hands in hers, that she'd been praying for a daughter for 30 years and hadn't expected the universe to deliver one already so brave. I didn't know what to say to that. I still don't, fully, though I think about it often. When I walked down the aisle, My scar caught the afternoon light in a way I hadn't planned for, a thin, pale line running just beneath my left eye, and instead of hiding it under makeup the way I'd rehearsed doing for weeks, practicing in front of the mirror with concealer and careful strokes of foundation until it nearly vanished, I left it bare on the actual day. I don't fully understand what changed my mind that morning. I think it had something to do with looking at myself in the mirror while my hair was being pinned up, seeing the scar catch the light from the window, and realizing that covering it would feel like agreeing with the people who'd wanted it to be a secret shame instead of a fact. I wasn't interested in agreeing with them anymore about anything. Daniel noticed the moment he saw me at the end of the aisle. He always notices. It's one of the 1,000 small things I love about him. The way his attention moves over me not out of vigilance or worry, but out of a kind of ongoing tenderness, cataloging me the way you catalog something you never planned to stop paying attention to. He touched my cheek gently before he kissed me, right where the mark was, his thumb tracing the thin ridge of it with a lightness that made my eyes sting, like he was saying thank you to it for not being the thing that broke us, for being instead the thing that revealed, with brutal clarity, exactly who was worth keeping in my life and who wasn't. My family had tried to take him because they thought love was a resource that could be redirected, reassigned, handed off like a prize to whichever daughter performed desperation loudest or made the most convincing case for her own suffering. I think, in some warped corner of their logic, they genuinely believed that if Ren wanted him badly enough and complained about it loudly enough, the situation could simply be rearranged in her favor, the way so many things in our house had always been rearranged in her favor. The bigger bedroom, the college fund that mysteriously stretched further for her than it had for me, the benefit of the doubt in every argument we'd ever had since childhood. What they never understood, what I'm not sure they're capable of understanding even now, is that Daniel didn't choose me because I was convenient or because I happened to be standing in the right place at the right time. He chose me because I was me, because of the specific, unrepeatable way I laugh at his terrible puns, because of the 3 years I spent building a life and a career and a sense of self entirely apart from my family's approval, because of 1,000 small, particular things that belong to no one else. That kind of choosing isn't a thing you can inherit or negotiate or steal by showing up at someone's office with a manufactured excuse. My mother and sister spent so much energy trying to understand desire as a supply chain problem, something to be intercepted and redirected, that they never once stopped to consider it might simply not work that way. Some nights I still dream about that brick, about the particular color of the living room lamp, about the ringing in my ears, about the sound of my mother's laugh landing somewhere worse than the blow itself, a wound that never needed 17 stitches because it was never going to close on its own. I wake from those dreams with my heart pounding, disoriented for a few seconds in the dark, and then I remember, and the fear drains slowly out of me, replaced by something steadier. I wake up next to a man who stayed on the floor with me instead of running, who chose, in the space of a single terrible moment, to become the kind of person who kneels down rather than the kind who walks away. I remember that the story could have ended in that living room, could have been just one more quiet tragedy absorbed into a family silence, and it didn't. It just began there, ugly and bloody and impossible to look away from, and then, slowly, deliberately, on our own terms, it became something else entirely, something that belongs only to us, that no one else gets a vote in, not ever again.